Picture this. You're sitting in a warm, quiet room at the very edge of the world, just eating your dinner, when suddenly a man bursts through the door. He's screaming that you need to come outside immediately because you absolutely won't believe your eyes. Well, today we're diving into an explainer of what is arguably one of the most astonishing survival stories in human history. We're unpacking the unbelievable tale of the Endurance Expedition, a story where Mother Nature essentially treated a crew of tough, grown men like mere toys.
Let's start with Section 1, The Ghosts of South Georgia.
Okay, it's May 20, 1916. The captain of the Stromness whaling station on South Georgia Island drops his dinner, rushes outside into the biting wind, and just stops dead in his tracks. Standing right there in front of him are three figures. They are painfully thin, their clothes are little more than filthy rags, and their faces are completely hidden behind these massive, wild beards. Honestly, they look like men who haven't bathed or seen civilization in years. So who were these strangers? The whaling captain asks for their names. The man in the middle steps forward and simply says, Ernest Shackleton. And the captain? Stunned into utter silence for 10 full seconds. See, the last time anyone heard that name was back in November 1914, nearly 2 years prior, right before Shackleton and his 28-man crew sailed off to cross Antarctica. The entire world presumed they were dead. Yet here he was. And the story he was about to tell of surviving extreme temperatures and just unfathomable cruelty from nature was almost beyond belief.
Let's flash back for a second to see how this whole nightmare actually began. The grand plan was the Trans-Antarctic Expedition, which basically meant crossing the entire Antarctic continent on foot. Shackleton picked his 28-man crew incredibly carefully. He wasn't just looking for skill. He wanted men who absolutely wouldn't crack under immense pressure. They departed England in August 1914, right as the world was gearing up for World War I. By December, they left South Georgia in their specially reinforced ship, the Endurance, heading straight into the treacherous Weddell Sea. But by January 1915, their progress had slowed to an agonizing crawl. The sea was literally freezing around them. Just pushing the ship 1 single kilometer felt like winning a war.
Which brings us to Section 2, Trapped in a Frozen Prison.
By February 1915, the terrifying reality really set in. The Endurance wasn't just temporarily stuck in the ice anymore, she was locked in. The ocean had frozen completely solid right around the hull. And it gets worse. The ice sheet they were trapped in wasn't stationary. It was this massive floating island of ice, drifting aimlessly through the Weddell Sea, dragging the ship and its helpless crew further and further off course. As the Antarctic winter approached, temperatures plunged to a bone-chilling -40°C. Now, keep in mind, during an Antarctic winter, the sun doesn't rise at all for months, so they were trapped on a floating block of ice, in total darkness, thousands of miles from civilization, with no radio and absolutely no way to call for help.
Shackleton knew right away that psychological despair would kill his men long before the cold ever did. So, to fight off that despair, he instituted a super strict daily routine. First, socialize and play with the sled dogs. Second, play full-on games of football out there on the frozen ocean. And third, work relentlessly to break the ice around the ship. Shackleton basically used this structured routine to maintain morale and keep those 28 men from completely losing their minds as they watched their grand mission crumble around them.
Moving into Section 3, Surviving on Shifting Ice.
By April 1915, the ice holding them began turning incredibly violent. Massive sheets of ice were colliding, creating just immense pressure on the wooden hull of the Endurance. The sensory details here are absolutely horrifying. The pressure of millions of tons of ice squeezing that ship sounded like actual cannon fire going off, day and night. It got so intense that the heavy steel bolts holding the ship together actually began popping and shooting right across the deck like bullets. Eventually, the hull just gave way entirely and freezing ocean water rushed in. In the dead of the dark Antarctic winter, the crew had absolutely no choice but to evacuate onto the exact same ice that was actively crushing their home. After camping on the ice for months and watching their ship get slowly mangled, the Endurance finally slipped beneath the ice and sank forever in November. And it was at this exact moment that Shackleton really proved why he's a legend. Standing on a barren ice floe with no ship and no radio, he looked at his defeated men and told them, "Our mission ends here, now we go home." Literally in a split second, he pivoted from this ambitious explorer to a hardcore survivalist. He became an absolute ray of hope for his men.
But getting home meant they now had to march across the ice, pulling their lifeboats. And that meant brutal rationing. 2 pounds. Shackleton ordered that every single man could only take exactly 2 pounds of personal gear. Everything else had to be left behind to save weight. And this rule even applied to the expedition's photographer, Frank Hurley. He was forced to leave his heavy glass plates behind, agonizingly selecting and saving just 150 historic photographs, which, by the way, are the only reason we even have visual evidence of this incredible story today.
This takes us to Section 4, Escape to Elephant Island. By early 1916, summer had finally arrived. Now, that sounds like great news, right? But it was actually a death sentence. The solid ice they had been living on for over a year began to soften, melt, and crack apart right beneath their feet. They had to reach land immediately. So they loaded up their 3 lifeboats. But dragging them across that slushy, splitting ice was just pure agony. 1,000 kilograms. That is how much each lifeboat weighed. Think about that. Exhausted, freezing men had to drag these massive, heavy wooden boats across miles of jagged ice, all while surviving on a daily diet of literally just one single biscuit, a little bit of cocoa powder, and whatever penguin or seal meat they happened to hunt.
On April 7, 1916, the ice cracked right through their camp, splitting it in two. They finally dropped the boats into the freezing water, but they found themselves caught in a terrifying geographical trap. Clarence Island was closer, just 80 kilometers to the north, but brutal easterly winds were actively pushing their tiny boats away from it. Then there was Elephant Island. It was much farther away at 160 kilometers, but thanks to the ocean currents, it offered the absolute best chance for survival and eventual rescue. Shackleton had to make the tough call, and he did. Elephant Island it was. Amazingly, on April 15, 1916, they finally did it. After roughly a year and a half floating on shifting ocean ice, those 28 men finally felt solid ground beneath their feet again. But the relief was incredibly short-lived. See, Elephant Island was completely barren. No animals, no plants, and most terrifyingly, it was located way outside any known shipping lanes. No one was ever going to just accidentally sail past them. They were completely marooned.
Which brings us to Section 5, the impossible rescue mission.
Shackleton knew that just waiting on Elephant Island meant waiting to die, so he made an unthinkable decision. He would take a tiny, modified 22-foot lifeboat, choose 5 men, leave the other 22 behind on that desolate beach, and sail off to find help. It was practically a suicide mission. 1,300 kilometers. That was the distance from Elephant Island back to the whaling stations of South Georgia. And to get there, they had to cross the Drake Passage, which is infamous for having literally the most violent seas on the entire planet. We're talking about a tiny wooden boat facing 12-meter-high waves in a stretch of ocean where, historically, over 20,000 sailors had already perished. Yet, just navigating by the stars in this violently pitching boat, they somehow made it across.
But of course, the nightmare wasn't over when they finally hit South Georgia in May 1916. A massive hurricane forced them to land on the completely uninhabited, totally wrong side of the island. To actually reach the whaling station, they had to choose between sailing another 200 kilometers around the jagged coast in their battered boat or hiking 40 kilometers straight across the island's interior. Shackleton chose the hike. He and 2 of the men marched continuously for 36 hours without any sleep or proper climbing gear. They scaled 4 towering, completely unmapped mountain peaks and even slid blindly down glaciers, all just to reach the other side.
And finally, Section 6, an incredible legacy of survival.
So when those 3 ragged, completely unrecognizable men stumbled into that whaling station, stunning the captain who was just trying to eat his dinner, Shackleton's first thought wasn't even about resting. It was about the 22 men he had left behind on Elephant Island. By May 1916, he was already organizing rescue ships. Over the next 3 months, he made 3 separate rescue attempts, and all of them failed, blocked by completely impenetrable sea ice. But Shackleton, he absolutely refused to give up on his crew. He borrowed a Chilean ship, and on his 4th attempt, on August 30, 1916, he finally broke through the ice and saw Elephant Island again.
And what exactly were the men on Elephant Island doing all those months? They were somehow surviving under 2 flipped-over lifeboats. Every single morning, Shackleton's second-in-command, Frank Wild, would wake up those freezing, starving men and tell them, "Shackleton is coming. Get ready." They never lost hope, simply because their leader had instilled this truly unbreakable belief in them.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy final question. What is the absolute limit of human endurance? How is it even possible that after nearly 2 years of being crushed by ice, frozen, starved, and pushed completely beyond the brink, every single one of those 28 men survived? It stands today not just as a story of a failed expedition, but really as the ultimate testament to the unbreakable human spirit and masterful leadership. Definitely something to think about the next time you face what feels like an impossible obstacle. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you on the next Explainer.